So, in the next couple presentations, I want to talk about Martin Luther King's concept of civil disobedience. Um, in the letter I had you read, the letter from the Birmingham jail, he's justifying his practice of civil disobedience, saying why he thinks it's necessary. He doesn't give an exact account of what he thinks civil disobedience is, but I think from King's practice, you can come up with a pretty good account of what he thinks civil disobedience is, and I think it's worth going into it explicitly. Um, so we'll go through them. We'll also go into some objections to this traditional account of civil disobedience. Um, all right. So King's practice of civil disobedience. He doesn't really list the conditions here, but he pretty clearly thinks that breaking the law, either because the law itself is unjust or breaking another law to draw attention to unjust laws, is justified. Um, but he thinks there are strict conditions on it, that you can only break the law when these conditions are met. Um, so we'll talk about those in a second. But I think the idea behind it, or the ideas behind it, you can already see in the letter from the Birmingham jail. So one thing here is that you want to break the law, or you hold it open as a possibility, but you want to show respect for the law. You don't just disregard it. He thinks there's a way you can break the law that will still show respect for the law. And also, as he emphasizes in the letter from the Birmingham jail, he sees civil disobedience as a form of communication. You are not trying to just twist someone's arm into doing something. You're trying to communicate, or at least start a process of communication, start a conversation. So, the conditions on civil disobedience, at least as King conceives of it, and this is, I will say, a very influential way to think of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience has to be a last resort, it has to be nonviolent, and those involved have to accept the punishment. So I want to go through each of these conditions, talk about the reasons for the conditions, and also how it applies to this case. And in the next lecture, I might push back a bit on these, whether, as a matter of fact, justified civil disobedience has to follow these conditions. Especially number 3, some people will push back on. So the first condition on civil disobedience is that it has to be a last resort. You can't just break the law because you think it's unjust or you think it's justified. It has to be a last resort. That means you have to have tried to change the unjust law through every other means that has a chance of succeeding. So last resort, think back to the ideas behind civil disobedience. It shows respect for the law in that you have tried all legal means. You've tried doing it through legal means. It's only as a last resort you're falling back on breaking the law. Last resort also fits in with this idea of communication. You're trying to get a hearing for your case. You're trying to start communication. You're only doing this because you've been ignored and the other side won't listen. So hopefully this idea of last resort makes sense. Now look, we can argue about what is and isn't a last resort, but clearly in the case of, the segregation laws that King is marching against, pretty clearly this is a last resort, right? Since pretty much the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, we've had these really unfair laws. African Americans in the South and elsewhere have tried to get them changed through peaceful means. For over 90 years at this point, it hasn't worked. I think you can pretty safely say this is the last resort. Non-violent. Now, part of this, again, is respect for the law, right? One of the things we think about when we talk about rule of law, respect for the government, is that the government has a monopoly, you might say, on using force. The government can use force if need be, citizens can't, except in really exceptional circumstances, self-defense or something like that. The nonviolent aspect of civil disobedience shows respect for that because they're not claiming this right to use violence. They're leaving the right to use force, the right to use violence, to the state. Again, it also fits in with this idea that civil disobedience is a form of communication. You're not threatening people. You're not forcing them to do something. Again, you are just trying to convey the seriousness of your cause or the sort of weight of the injustice that's being done. Now, one thing to note here, definitely King's practice satisfied this, the protesters, civil rights marchers, trained to be nonviolent, not to retaliate even when met with, really brutal violence themselves. Now, the emphasis was always on no violence against persons, right? But King himself would say, we're also not going to destroy property either. Now, just to be clear, he certainly doesn't think destruction of property is anything close to the level of threatening any kind of violence against people. But civil disobedience, non-violent, non-destructive, at least the traditional concept of civil disobedience. Finally, must take punishment. Again, this showing respect for the law. You engage in civil disobedience, you don't try to avoid the punishment. This shows respect for the law. It also shows how seriously if you're engaging in civil disobedience, how seriously you take your side of things, how far you're willing to go to meet this injustice. Now, one thing to note here is I'm not sure that Socrates and King would really disagree, right? Socrates would say you have a duty to obey the law. You need a lot of justification to break the law, and if you do break the law, you have to take your punishment. Well, it seems that King would agree with this idea and just makes explicit what those conditions are beyond just taking your punishment. Okay, so hopefully you guys can understand the rationale for the traditional concept of civil disobedience, right? When all else fails, people need some sort of fallback, need the possibility of engaging and breaking the law to, bring about some kind of change if everything else fails. But even that, they would say, must meet strict conditions. It's not just breaking the law because you feel like it, right? And I think even if we think there is a duty to obey the law, even someone like Socrates might say civil disobedience can be justified. Strict conditions on doing this, it's not just breaking the law because you feel like it.